Okay, so sometimes you've got genes regulating or genes influencing behavior. But now we bring in a whole other possibility. And this is something that was emphasized by a psychologist named Judith Rich Harris a number of years ago, a very important book of hers called The Nurture Assumption, which has a lot to do with arguing the relative importance of influences of peer versus parents. Nonetheless, she focused in one section of the book on the genetics of behavior and focused on what she calls indirect genetic effects. What would indirect genetic effects be? Okay. You've got that trait that I referred to before, one of the most reliable of traits in the identical twin separated at birth business, 50% heritability of where you are on the introversion-extroversion continuum. Okay, so that one is held up pretty well amid all the possible sort of complaints about these various approaches. That one appears to be quite solid, and you're immediately off and running with, okay, genes for extroversion, for sociality, for all of that. What she shows instead is something else is happening. There's a very, very heritable trait from parent to offspring, one of the most heritable physical traits out there, which is your height and your appearance in general. That those are highly heritable traits. And suddenly you have a phenomenon that is well documented, which is people who are taller are treated better and considered more attractive, comma, he says bitterly. What you've got is people are treated differently along those lines, and what is known also is people who are treated more positively during development, during childhood, become more extroverted. What we have here is not heritability of the trait where you are in the introversion-extroversion continuum. What you have is heritability of a physical trait which causes you to be treated differently in the world, which then brings about changes in personality. And studies have since shown that most of the heritability of the introversion-extroversion is mediated by physical traits in between. So that's a completely indirect way in which you could have gotten to this. More cases of this. Let's see. Okay, you can show in various bird, turkey, hen species that there are chicks that there is heritability of rank. You could be born to a low-ranking mom in the pecking order, high-ranking, all the perfect studies and controls and cross-fostering and all of that, and there is heritability of rank. But another indirect genetic effect that was subsequently demonstrated, which is it's not the rank that's being inherited, it's a particular version of genes related to melanism of your feathers, the color and iridescence of your feathers. And it turns out if you have a certain color pattern, all the other like roosters and chicks and hens and poultry peck at you more often, and you're reduced to subordination. This is not inheritance of a social dominance trait or a social subordination trait. This is inheritance of a gene having to do with the color and iridescence of your feathers, which wind up producing your social rank. Another example. Here's another one. Okay, back to chicks again, which is chicks appear to be intuitively able to peck at grubs shortly after birth. That they're able to peck down and get grubs, and by all the rules of behavior genetics, with all the constraints and criticisms answered, this appears to be a heritable trait. But it turns out that this is not what is heritable. What is heritable, bizarrely, is the tendency of newborn chicks to find their toes to be very interesting and to peck at their toes. And they quickly learn that this doesn't feel all that great, but if you do it in somewhat more sloppy of a way, you get one of these things that's squirmy that tastes good. They start off, what is genetic is the tendency to peck at your feet. God knows why. If you were a newborn chick, because of extremely elegant high technology studies in which newborn chicks are put in galoshes or something, and they don't peck and they don't show the seemingly innate ability to peck for grubs. So here we have a behavioral trait which in fact is indirectly mediated by something else. More examples. There is by now a literature showing approximately 70% heritability, and I keep using this word. We are going to dissect the word heritability big time in a short while. There's about 70% heritability of political party affiliation in this country. Sharing that behavioral trait with your parents. Whoa, what is that about? That's sure disturbing, and that sure makes you want to go procreate in the name of your political stances or whatever. And this appears to hold up pretty well to some of the standard criticisms in the literature, and it's got nothing to do with this. What's the mediating variable? A large, really interesting literature showing when you compare political or social progressives with political or social conservatives, one of the most reliable personality differences is how they feel about ambiguity. Conservatives, on the average, do not like ambiguity. They are much more ambiguity averse, and you can start it with showing ambiguous sensory stimuli in kids and looking at heart rate responses to it, and that tends to be a stable personality difference at political extremes. You will see sometime later on that there's a whole world of moral development in kids where there's various scales measuring it, one called one's Kohlberg stage of moral development, that there was an old literature suggesting political differences as to how fancy of a Kohlberg stage you got to. We will see that despite what struck me as the intuitive sort of logic of what was found, that one hasn't held up. But one that does hold up is difference in ambiguity tolerance. And that's probably the mediating trait. It is not inheriting a tendency to like elephants or donkeys or whatever. It is instead having this intermediate trait. Final example of what would be an intermediate trait. There's a whole bunch of rat and mouse strains that have been developed that have differing levels of aggression. High aggression strains, and you do all the proper controls, and you can show this is a genetic trait. Whoa, heritability of aggression. We're suddenly back to twin adoption studies in Ketty with heritability of criminality, all of that. Heritability of aggression, what's actually going on in all of the strains identified to date by spontaneous traits coming up and then breeding for it. What you see instead is the strain that is so aggressive and so pissy and so impossible and so unconstrained by the law and order of rodent society and all of that. They've got lower threshold for pain sensitivity. Things hurt them more readily, and they're more likely to become aggressive at that point. It turns out it's genetic differences in the neurobiology of pain sensitivity. So what we're seeing here over and over is, amid the gazillion of criticisms we've had about when does environment actually start and when do environmental assumptions of being treated the same go down the tubes and differential inheritance of genes. Yeah, some traits do appear to have some fairly strong genetic components, but even once you get that far, they very often are through some very indirect routes.